China restructures Sri Lanka's debt, but are these steps enough to reshape the Sri Lankan economy? Challenges faced by the Belt and Road Initiative and what happens to the strategy after the coup in Myanmar. China's role in illicit fentanyl on the streets of the United States. Before we dive into today's topics, please like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on the China news. Now, without further ado, let's discuss the Sri Lankan debt restructuring situation. As you may know, in March of 2022, the people of Sri Lanka stood up against the government scrutinized for mismanaging the economy, which led to the subsequent economic crisis. This resulted in severe inflation, daily blackouts, fuel shortage, domestic gas, and other essential goods. The protesters' primary demand was the removal of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa and key officials from the Rajapaksa family. For those in the dark, the Rajapaksa family is one of the most influential families in Sri Lanka. They have been in power since 1936 and have represented the Hambantota district. Now, the name Hambantota will sound familiar to some of you. If you are in the dark, don't worry, we will come back to it later. After a lot of struggle, the country finally got a new president. However, China still needs to do more to restructure the loans while desperately seeking a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Before we get to the talks about debt restructuring, let's understand the role China plays in the economic collapse of Sri Lanka. Firstly, the Sri Lankan economy depends mainly on tourism, which accounts for 10 to 15% of the country's GDP. Not all tourists were Chinese, but they accounted for a large portion of it, which took a fall because of the COVID crisis. China provided Sri Lanka with aid to end the Sri Lankan civil war and create infrastructure with ambitions of making it the next Singapore. But the mismanagement of the funds by the Rajapaksas and the unfavorable conditions of the loan and the line of credit meant Sri Lanka could not repay these loans. Sri Lanka achieved economic growth through external borrowing, and the primary facilitator of these loans was China. Mahinda Rajapaksa approved multiple Chinese infrastructure projects, the primary of which was the Hambantota port. Global Strat Views said the port, developed with significant Chinese funding, had no commercial viability. But China persuaded Sri Lanka to proceed with the project. But as predicted, the port was not commercially viable, but the CCP wanted it as collateral. They compelled the Sri Lankan government to lease the port to a Chinese corporation for 99 years, citing the mismanagement of the port. Sri Lanka achieved economic growth through external borrowing, and the primary facilitator of these loans was China. China's model of economic development adopted for Sri Lanka included a handful of Chinese companies investing in specific projects, along with higher interest rates and agreements to govern such investments. China's blind eye to the economic and political condition of Sri Lanka allowed the spread of corruption and endemic borrowing. This resulted in the country being made into hostage to Chinese investments, which worsened the structural weaknesses in the economy and contributed to the current crisis. Now that we understand how the CCP is responsible for the struggles faced by Sri Lankans, given that China is Sri Lanka's largest bilateral creditor, finalization or even basic agreements about debt restructuring require its involvement and support. But we are not talking about dealing with one entity. A few Chinese financial institutions have provided loan to Sri Lanka. Based on relevant studies, the individual banks that have provided the loan will make their own decision, so they cannot be expected to act in one concert in the depth of restructuring negotiations. And even with China Exim Bank, the different departments provide different lending and have other restructuring methods. Therefore, a great deal of consensus within and between policy banks is required for China to formulate its approach to debt restructuring. Xin Xiangjia, the Director General of the People's Bank of China International Affairs Department, recently provided some insights into the complexities of debt restructuring. Jin said, "If now the government is to tell them what to do, it is a complicated process as the government did not participate in most of the project-level decisions in the first place." He added that Chinese creditor organizations have relatively little experience dealing with large-scale debt restructures and need to learn by doing. This means that amid Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process, there might be a need to gain consensus among a wide array of Chinese state-linked entities, not simply the policy banks and the political leadership. The political leadership also faces a constraint concerning offering debt relief to foreign countries, a potential perception among Chinese citizens that their government is subsidizing other countries in crisis at a time they have been struggling through the COVID-19 pandemic and an overall economic shutdown. This puts Sri Lanka in a very precarious situation where China's inability to restructure the debts and the banks that have lent the money can't jointly agree on a restructuring plan, as they are inexperienced in giving out international loans. Only time will tell how this situation pans out. For the time being, let's look at the problems faced by the Belt and Road Initiative and what happened to CMEC after the coup against the Myanmar government. The Belt and Road Initiative has left scores of lower and middle-income countries saddled with hidden debts totaling about $385 trillion. The number of mega projects financed with loans worth USD 500 million or more approved each year tripled during the first 5 years of BRI implementation. Despite larger loans and expanded loan portfolios, BRI has yet to lead to significant changes in the sectoral or geographical composition of China's overseas development finance program. According to a report, 35% of BRI infrastructure projects have encountered problems ranging from corruption scandals to labor violations. These sovereign loans are extended to developing countries and negotiated in secret. A few of these loans use resources as collateral. This debt trap diplomacy, the lack of transparency, and unreasonable loan conditions have made these schemes extremely unpopular and, as a result, have earned the BRI a lot of bad press. The latest report reveals new insights about the BRI. It comes at a time when the US government and its allies are seeking to develop a viable alternative to the BRI under the auspices of the Build Back Better World (B3W) initiative that the G7 announced in June 2021. In a bid to compete with BRI, even the European Union recently launched the Global Gateway, a new infrastructure development scheme. The other competition and the bad press received by the BRI have resulted in some projects slowing down or halting in some cases. To add to the problems of the CCP, 2 years ago, Myanmar had a military coup which unseated Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi's elected government. US-based conflict monitoring group ACLED says about 19,000 people died last year as a crackdown on protests led many to take up arms against the military. According to the United Nations, some 1.2 million people have been displaced, and over 70,000 have left the country, which has accused the military of war crimes and crimes against humanity. This brings us to how China is succeeding in achieving its ambition with CMEC. Myanmar is of core strategic importance to China, as it has access to the Bay of Bengal and the more expansive Indian Ocean, and China transfers its oil and gas pipelines through Myanmar. If CMEC succeeds, China can shift manufacturing from its coastal areas to its southwestern provinces to avoid the middle income trap. Transporting goods through Myanmar provides shorter routes to South Asia, East Africa, West Asia, and Europe markets. It opens the Myanmar market to all Chinese goods and services, while allowing China to import raw materials from Myanmar and beyond efficiently. So since China had a lot invested in Aung San Suu Kyi's government, they very conveniently turned a blind eye to the war crimes and human rights abuses, and in August, China delivered a refurbished submarine to Myanmar's navy. Wang's visit to Myanmar in April 2022, during which he announced that no matter how the situation changes, China will support Myanmar, was the definitive sign of a return to business as usual. The coup also resulted in a free fall of foreign investments, which allowed China to hold most of the cards and enabled them to control the tiny details of the CMEC project. With China managing all the projects mainly of its choosing, it is possible to discern a pattern, strategic drive, and motivation. All these projects are located in the geographical periphery of Myanmar. So even though Myanmar's political future remains uncertain, one thing is for sure: China is making itself into a critical player, so in the end, whichever political forces prevails will all be indebted to Beijing, ensuring China continues to build essential infrastructure around Myanmar's periphery under CMEC. It will wait to connect it by the road and rail when the country is more stable, regardless of the cost of that stability to the people of Myanmar. And now we move on from CCP ensuring it ruins Myanmar, its economy, and its future to fentanyl destroying the streets of the United States. Before you think we're exaggerating China's role in this trade, just know that China is the world's largest producer of fentanyl. Most of the fentanyl on American, Canadian, and Mexican streets comes from China, with Mexico behind the route for fentanyl to enter the US, and China is doing little to help the situation. Although China placed the entire class of fentanyl-type drugs and 2 essential fentanyl precursors under a controlled regulatory regime in May 2019, it remains the primary source of fentanyl in the US. The scheduling of fentanyl and stricter monitoring of mail has created some deterrence. But now, instead of finished fentanyl being shipped directly to the United States, most smuggling occurs via Mexico. Mexican criminal groups source fentanyl precursors from China and then traffic finished fentanyl from Mexico to the United States. So quite evidently, the scheduling of fentanyl and its precursors in China is insufficient to stem flows to the United States. China's enforcement of its fentanyl regulations is minimal, especially for the US. US-China counter-narcotics cooperation remains unproductive, with the US stating that the steps taken by the Chinese side to be inadequate and blaming China for its opioid epidemic. At the same time, Beijing points to its benevolence in anti-drug cooperation, and the souring of bilateral relations will result in Beijing taking even fewer steps in its anti-drug cooperation with the United States. And this is far from just speculation, as the CCP counter-narcotics diplomacy in Southeast Asia and the Pacific very seriously. Still, its operational law enforcement cooperation tends to be highly selective, self-serving, limited, and subordinated to its geopolitical interests. For example, after years of refuting international criticism of its role in meth precursor smuggling, China has only intensified its regional law enforcement cooperation with a few countries that it concedes of geopolitical interest. Well, that's all for today. You know the drill by now. Please like, comment, and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it helps us immensely with the YouTube algorithm. Until next time, peace.